Russia is losing all its allies. In fact, Maduro has been captured by the United States. Orban lost power in Hungary after 16 years, while Armenia is looking for new partners. And Azerbaijan is dealing with the Kremlin with a degree of autonomy that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Not to mention the fall of Assad in Syria at the end of 2024. Meanwhile, Iran has been weakened by its war with the United States. Lukashenko is trying to avoid direct conflict with Ukraine. And China, while remaining Moscow's most important partner, is becoming increasingly dominant over Russia. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos, and I'm really happy about that, but you're not subscribed, so if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Russia doesn't have an alliance system comparable to NATO, but it has created a fragmented network made up of military allies, governments dependent on Russian protection, and partners aligned with Moscow. Due to common interests, Armenia, for example, was a formal ally through the Collective Security Treaty Organization. A sort of small Russian NATO, while Belarus depends on Russia in terms of energy and economy, as well as militarily. Assad's regime, on the other hand, needed Russian intervention to survive. While Iran and Russia cooperate because they share opposition to the United States, the need to limit the effects of Western sanctions and various military interests, they are not bound by a mutual defense obligation. Maduro's Venezuela, on the other hand, offered Moscow a political presence in Latin America and the possibility of maintaining a government hostile to the United States on the American continent. And then we come to Europe, where Viktor Orban led Hungary, a country that was a member of NATO and the European Union. However, he maintained relations with Putin and slowed down many European decisions against Russia or in favor of Ukraine. For example, think about the 90 billion loan to Ukraine that Orban blocked until his fall. The fact is that the functioning of this pro-Russian network depends, or perhaps depended, on Russia's ability to protect its partners. Why could an isolated government agree to get closer to Moscow, knowing it could receive weapons, energy, and diplomatic support without having to answer to the West? And the intervention in Syria in 2015, in support of Assad against the rebels, had strengthened this image, showing a Russia capable of intervening far from its own borders and saving an allied government close to defeat. In fact, when Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war in 2015, Bashar al-Assad's government had lost control of a good part of the country, and it was in trouble. And so the Russian Air Force, together with Iranian forces, intervened for the regime's mere survival. For Putin, this was crucial. It was crucial, an important victory, because Russia became a key player in the Middle East again, showed it could protect an ally, and above all, it kept 2 military bases in the region. We're talking about the naval base in Tartus, which can guarantee Moscow stable access to the Mediterranean, and the air base in Hmeimim, which was the main operational center of the Russian intervention in Syria. However, in December 2024, the Syrian regime collapsed and Assad had to flee to Russia. Despite years of military and diplomatic support for the Syrian government, Moscow couldn't intervene or stop its fall at the crucial moment. Because the war in Ukraine had already absorbed much of Russia's capabilities, but Russia has not yet left Syria. And in fact, it immediately began negotiating with the new Syrian president to maintain its bases. Although the current government forces were bombed for years by the Russian Air Force, the new Syrian government has now requested better terms for Russian bases to remain. The cancellation of part of the debts accumulated during Assad's government and compensation for the destruction caused by the war. Moscow's stance has changed, as under Assad's regime, Russian troops could move almost freely across the country, whereas now they have to submit to the new local authorities, who until 2 years ago were fighting on Moscow's side. However, the fact remains that Syria needs resources to rebuild a country devastated by more than a decade of civil war, with costs estimated at around $400 billion. And so it cannot ignore a country that continues to supply wheat and oil. This shows Moscow wants to shift from military protection to a stronger economic and commercial role. And consider this. According to some officials cited by Russia, Russia aimed to launch a commercial logistics center in the port of Tartus in July 2026. Using one of the 2 docks for Russian goods and maintaining a reduced naval presence in the other. The project was initially supposed to handle about 250,000 tons of products per month. However, the Syrian authority responsible for the ports later denied the existence of this agreement. Therefore, the situation remains uncertain for the future of the Russian bases. However, Syria's dependence on certain Russian products continues to give Putin a tool of influence. Consider that in the 2025-2026 season, about 85% of the wheat imported by Syria came from Russia and occupied Crimea. Meanwhile, in 2025, the country had received about 16.8 million barrels of Russian oil. Moscow no longer needs to negotiate with a government reliant on Putin's protection to remain in power. Most importantly, it is also seeking closer ties with the West. Not to mention that the new Syrian government has excellent relations with Erdogan's Turkey, a NATO country heavily armed and certainly not intimidated by the Russians as it has shown in the past. And then there's Maduro's recent downfall in Venezuela. Maduro's Venezuela offered Russia a political partner in the Americas, as well as energy and military relations, and the chance to show that Moscow could influence areas near the United States. And think about it, Maduro and Putin had signed a strategic partnership just 8 months before the Venezuelan president was captured by the Americans in January 2026. And in fact, Russia condemned the operation and had called for Maduro's release, but in reality, it couldn't do anything more. So much so that some Russian nationalists saw the episode as a blow to the Kremlin's prestige, arguing that Venezuela had relied on protection that Moscow was unable to provide while it was engaged in Ukraine. And now, of course, Russia can maintain relations with members of Maduro's old regime and try to open a dialogue with the new quote-unquote government. However, Moscow has still lost the leader, who represented the real connection between the two countries and allowed Putin to demonstrate Russia's presence in the Americas. As for Venezuela, I say quote-unquote new government because Maduro's deputy is currently in charge. The loss of Viktor Orban in Hungary, on the other hand, has consequences mainly within Europe, because Orban was not a formal ally of Russia, obviously, but during his government Hungary had continued to buy Russian oil and gas. Then he supported the construction of the nuclear power plant in Pax, a town in Hungary, and he obstructed several European decisions on Ukraine. For example, before his electoral defeat, he blocked a European loan of 90 billion euros that was meant for Kyiv. The fact is, however, that in April 2026, Orban lost the elections to Peter Magyar after 16 years in power, causing a very negative reaction among various Russian commentators. They feared Budapest might stop slowing European support for Ukraine, so the Kremlin quickly sought talks with the new government. While Magyar did say he wants to temporarily maintain Russian energy supplies and a pragmatic relationship with Putin, on the other hand, he no longer wants to be Europe's loose cannon. Economic ties between Hungary and Russia won't end immediately, but Moscow has lost a leader who used conflict with Brussels to block European decisions and Ukraine's defense. But now we come to the point that hurts Putin the most: the Caucasus. The most significant loss of Russian influence is happening in the South Caucasus, a region that Moscow has considered its own strategic area for decades. First under the Russian Empire, then under the Soviet Union, and again, in quotes, under Russia. And we're talking about countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as Georgia. Anyway, Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan had established a balance in which Moscow was allied with Yerevan. It sold weapons to Baku and presented itself as a mediator in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia, the control of Nagorno-Karabakh. This system allowed Russia to remain indispensable for both countries because Armenia depended on Russian military protection, while Azerbaijan had to avoid Moscow fully supporting the Armenian government. But since 2022, the war in Ukraine has reduced the resources to maintain this role, forcing Russia to shift almost all its attention to the front line. Keep in mind that, according to Sisi's, Moscow has moved hundreds of soldiers previously stationed at Russian bases in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to Ukraine. And it has also reduced part of its forces in the occupied Georgian territories. And Armenia has interpreted this reduced presence as a failure of Russia's security guarantees. And keep in mind that Armenia belongs to Russia's version of NATO, is part of the Eurasian Economic Union, and hosts a Russian military base. But despite this, in 2023, Moscow did not prevent Azerbaijan from conquering Nagorno-Karabakh, causing almost the entire Armenian population of the region to flee to Armenia. Russia wasn't automatically required to intervene in Nagorno-Karabakh since it's internationally recognized as Azerbaijani territory. However, for many Armenians, this did not erase the feeling of having been abandoned by their main ally. And so, in 2024, Armenia has frozen its participation in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, claiming that the alliance failed to protect the country. Pashinyan's government, which recently won re-election in Armenia, has also expanded relations with the West by approving a law in 2025 to start the process of joining the European Union, and by signing a strategic partnership with the United States in May 2026, and an agreement on cooperation in the critical minerals sector. And the agreements also include the Trip Corridor, a 43-kilometer stretch through southern Armenia that is supposed to connect Azerbaijan with Turkey, creating a route between Asia and Europe that bypasses Russia and Iran. Furthermore, in August 2025, Armenia and Azerbaijan had signed an agreement in Washington promoted by the United States, committing to respect each other's territorial integrity and to move toward normalizing relations. The agreement gave the United States development rights for the logistics corridor and eased some military cooperation restrictions with Azerbaijan, while Russia instead found itself excluded from one of the region's most important negotiations, which it had tried to control for decades. Now, pay attention. Armenia still remains tied to Moscow economically and in terms of energy. In 2025, Russia accounted for about 35% of Armenia's foreign trade. In July 2026, Pashinyan met the Russian Prime Minister, stating his intent to resolve issues between the countries. However, in the month following the Armenian elections, the European Union had already distributed 52 million euros in economic support and relaxed some rules on Armenian exports to the European market. Yerevan is trying to preserve the benefits of its relationship with Moscow while also seeking political and economic alternatives. Moscow clearly dislikes this, and Putin responded with restrictions on imports of Armenian products and with the threat of increasing the price of gas in case Yerevan moved further away from Russia. But Azerbaijan is also taking a more independent approach, with its relations with Russia having deteriorated. After the crash of an Azerbaijan Airlines plane in December 2024 in which 38 people died, Baku immediately claimed that it had been accidentally hit by Russian air defenses. And tensions further increased after the death in Russia of 2 Azerbaijani citizens who had been arrested by the police. The Azerbaijani government accused the Russian authorities of violence and demanded a proper investigation. Baku responded by arresting 2 Russian state media journalists and several Russian citizens. But why? Does Baku now have the strength to take a harder line against Russia? Why does Azerbaijan now have more autonomy compared to the past? Thanks to oil and gas exports to Europe, thanks to its relationship with Turkey, and thanks to the victories achieved against Armenia between 2020 and 2023. But now, pay attention, Moscow still has important economic ties with the Caucasus. And between 2021 and 2024, trade with Armenia rose from $2.6 to $12 billion. Trade with Azerbaijan went from $3 to $4.8 billion, and trade with Georgia from $1.6 to $2.5 billion. However, it should also be said that part of this growth probably depends on the routes used by the Russians to bypass Western sanctions. So it's not certain that this growth will last over time. And what about Iran? Russia and Iran share military interests, economic relations, opposition to the American presence, and both are trying to reduce the impact of Western sanctions. And during the war in Ukraine, Iranian cooperation on drones and military technologies has greatly helped Moscow sustain its own war production. However, the relationship lacks a mutual defense obligation, which became clear when Iran faced American attacks. After the Iranian supreme leader's death and the conflict's escalation in March 2026, Russia and China condemned it. However, the operations avoided direct military intervention, as Moscow was already involved in Ukraine and mainly wanted to avoid direct confrontation with the United States. Moscow's interest in good relations with Gulf countries shouldn't be underestimated. Moreover, the Iranian crisis could bring some advantages for Russia because the increase in oil prices supported Moscow's energy revenues, while greater Western involvement in the Middle East reduced media attention on Ukraine. However, the most important point concerns Iran's future ability to support Russia, as it has done so far. Because a country forced to rebuild its own defenses and protect strategic infrastructure might have fewer drones, missiles, and economic resources to provide to Moscow. And now we finally come to Belarus. But first, I wanted to tell you that if you appreciate my content and want this project to continue, you can also support me by becoming a channel member. It's less than €2 a month, but for me, it really makes a difference, so I don't have to rely only on views and sponsors. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart to everyone who has already become a channel member and to everyone who decides to become one. Let's get back to the video. Belarus is the country closest to and most integrated with Russia, on which it depends for energy, security, and the economy. And Lukashenko's dependence increased after the 2020 protests, especially when Russian support contributed to the survival of his government and made Minsk even more tied to the Kremlin. So much so that in February 2022, Belarus allowed Russian forces to use its territory to attack Ukraine and later expanded military cooperation with Moscow, hosting Russian infrastructure and nuclear weapons. However, Lukashenko avoided sending the Belarusian army directly to the front, and in May 2026 during joint nuclear exercises, he also stated that Belarus would not allow itself to be dragged into the conflict. In fact, direct involvement would expose Minsk to Ukrainian attacks, increase internal tensions, and deploy an inexperienced army in a very difficult conflict. However, in 2026, Zelensky accused Moscow of wanting to drag Minsk even further into the conflict and spoke of unusual activity near the border, while Lukashenko rejected the accusations. And then, the ultimatum from Kiev to Belarus in recent weeks is also emblematic, regarding the deactivation of antennas used by Russian drones against Ukraine. Lukashenko appears to have respected the ultimatum to avoid retaliation. Dialogue with the United States also helps reduce Minsk's isolation, with several contacts occurring between Washington and the Belarusian government. Negotiations resulted in the release of hundreds of political prisoners, as recognized by Western countries, in return for easing some sanctions on Belarus. Minsk's relationship with China then offers Lukashenko another economic and diplomatic partner. In short, Belarus is not abandoning Moscow and continues to be its most dependent ally. But even Lukashenko is now trying to limit the risks of the war and to gain autonomy. So in the end, is China Russia's last true ally? So China remains without a doubt Russia's most important international partner and has played a fundamental role in reducing the effects of Western isolation. In fact, Beijing has bought large quantities of Russian oil from Moscow, has provided industrial products, technologies, and has also maintained trade channels that have allowed Moscow to replace some European imports. Russia and China also share the goal of reducing American influence, and this cooperation shows no signs of breaking at the moment, but it is becoming very unbalanced in favor of Beijing. The case of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline is emblematic. In fact, Russia and China had announced an agreement in 2025 to build the project, but by May 2026, they still hadn't reached a deal on the gas price, and some sources even believed that the economic negotiations could last for years. And for Moscow, the pipeline is necessary to replace the sales lost in Europe, so Putin is in a bit of a hurry. Meanwhile, Beijing explores other supplies and leaves Moscow waiting. China is also increasing its influence in Central Asia, with trade reaching a record $106 billion in 2025 and Beijing boosting investments in infrastructure and military cooperation. These are areas where Russia has always had a central role and where it maintains deep ties. In 2025, it accounted for 19% of the total trade of Central Asian countries, and to make matters worse for Moscow, the European Union is also increasing its presence in the region. Trade with Central Asia reached 56 billion euros in 2024. In short, the region is becoming more open to different partners while Russia is losing ground. China consistently keeps Russia afloat while exploiting its weakness. Do you think Russia can regain its influence, or is it destined to become irrelevant? Write it in the comments, leave a like, hype it up, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. Bye.